we should move on to what is ultimately, I suppose, my bread and butter, and that is the Marxist-Leninist defence of academic freedom, which you would probably be quite surprising for a lot of people.
I'm also incredibly suspicious of.
Incredibly suspicious, and you are right to be suspicious of it to a point. But for those unaware, philosophy lecturer Kathleen Stock has been under unrelenting attack by the LGBT lobby, not just in the University of Sussex, but everywhere. But the lobby in Sussex has been calling for her to be dismissed because of her view, and on their view that she's a transphobe, for essentially believing that sexual orientation as a concept makes second to no sense without reference to biological sex. Of course, there's a much more sophisticated argument behind that, but that's the crux of her position. In the lobby's own words, what Stock advocates is not philosophy, just transphobia. And the University of Sussex rightly defended Stock on the principle of academic freedom. But they weren't the only ones to do so. The Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninists, that must be distinguished from the Communist Party of Britain, defended Kathleen Stock.
I forgot leftists just endlessly splinter, don't they?
Yeah. But they defended Stock on the grounds of academic freedom, but actually went further to say that the university had not gone far enough. And they said this: rather than support her, they issued a bizarre statement in support of trans and non-binary communities at Sussex, which criticises the Vice-Chancellor's statement and calls for an investigation into institutional transphobia. The statement contains the puzzling assertion that appeals to both employment rights and academic freedom and are often instrumentalised, a curious thing for an organisation self-identifying as a trade union to say. Sussex UCU's officers completely failed to support Stock herself. UCU nationally has sided with its local branch committee. And they basically go on to say the introduction of undergraduate tuition fees in 1998 by the Blair government has encouraged some students to claim paying for tuition allows them to dictate the views that can be exposed to, and it would seem, demand the sacking of those they disagree with. This is actually pretty amazing, because what's happening here is that you've got Marxist-Leninists saying that the Blair government has enabled a mob of middle-class, self-entitled, obnoxious brats with strange ideas to take over the universities and lecture everyone about their entirely abstract claims to oppression. For years, that is precisely what the left has constantly claimed to be the narrative of the far right. And the Marxist-Leninists have come round to saying almost exactly the same thing.
I mean, it's interesting, but I, as you mentioned, the far right, like, I'm incredibly suspicious of it in the same way of, like, a neo-Nazi was telling me, yeah, but, you know, free speech in this instance, all the rest of it. It's like, yeah. Like, the complaint there being that Blair made it a situation in which the students have turned into customers, as a chap at the Festival of Ideas mentioned, and therefore they're able to, like, dictate what should be allowed on campus, is this new idea that's come into being. But at the same time, like, coming from Marxist-Leninists, like, what is that complaint? It's like, yeah, we should be in charge instead of these people paying the money, is presumably where the position would end up being, as historically it has been. That's my...
Yeah, I mean, there is, I believe, a very, very, I suppose, profound reason why they're taking this line, and particularly why they're using this particular case of Kathleen Stock to make this point in favour of academic freedom. But they proceed to argue for the importance of free speech in trade unions, which itself does actually make sense. And they basically say that the importance, it's obvious stuff really, of the importance of free speech in trade unions is simple. Debate in a union branch needs every member's point of view, every perspective, before a decision is reached. And with that being done, members know they can rely on everyone to carry it out, whatever position they took in the discussion. And importantly, and we'll refer to this later, in scientific and academic discussion too, the alternative to free debate is enforced adherence to dogma and the suppression of new thinking.
They did this standing behind a sign that say Marxist-Leninists.
Yes.
Was the irony not lost?
You could make that argument, yes.
That's how I'm viewing all of this.
What's interesting, though, is that they this was of such importance that they actually had a Zoom meeting entirely about the role that free speech has to play in a Marxist-Leninist cause. And we can see that on their own website. There isn't actually any content to this, but it does make you wonder what exactly are they discussing? What is the potential role of free speech in the furthering, I just made up a word there, of Marxist-Leninism? And actually, because of course this wouldn't happen with the socialist worker, you can be sure of that. Okay, I'll tell you what I think it is.
You're going to have to tell me the difference there.
I think
all I know is a socialist worker is a Trotskyist. So
yeah, well, yeah, but I think it signifies an awakening to a very obvious fact. That those making such strong claims to Marxist cause, namely the critical race theorists and the intersectionalists, who, shall we say, are the most profound Marxists, and I say that in inverted commas, around at the moment, are actually part of the problem. They see them as part of the capitalist class trying to reconfigure what Marxism or progressivism actually is. So this is far from a random act of endorsement. So what orthodox Marxists are basically hinting to is that intersectionalists and critical race theorists are trying to do away with the important variable of the division of labour, which is inseparable from how Marxist-Leninists have naturally kind of identified the systemic problems of capitalism. Like, I mean, if given the division of labour between men and women and that it corresponds to their reproductive capacities, right? Capitalism is rigged against women from the very start, in the sense that they're naturally not more productive. If, for example, you have two people doing exactly the same job, happily married, whatever, want to raise a child, that overwhelmingly goes in favour of the man, right? Because he doesn't have to carry that child. So the argument basically has, from the Marxist-Lenin side, has more force with reference to biological sex, which the intersectionalists are trying to undermine constantly.
Right.
So I imagine what's happening here is that they've identified that freedom of speech potentially can be used as a means of reinforcing this, so as to restabilize Marxism on the more orthodox framework or on the more orthodox trajectory. Are you with me?
Yeah, I just find it really funny.
It is funny.
Like the idea of being like, no, we need to restabilize Marxism into a sense that's more coherent. And it's like, right, okay.
Yeah, but it would be more coherent, would it not? Because it would make more sense in and of itself, as contrived as a political sense as it may be.
No, I feel like intersectionality and wokeism as an ideology are essentially taking those principles and applying it on more basis.
Yeah, but it's very...
That's why it's the advancement of that.
Yeah, but that's just it's very easy to change the goalposts with Marxism, isn't it? Because it's, as Jordan Peterson actually says quite rightly, it ultimately breaks down into the oppressors versus the oppressed. Anyone can make that claim and can make a straw man about something that doesn't really exist. Yeah. And the intersectionists have done exactly that with Marxism. But there is, of course, a very, very particular way of looking at things from the Marxist-Leninist framework, which is strictly materialistic. And if you're going to start negating matter, then Marxism loses its force. So I think that may be why, and I am speculating to a considerable point here, why they have chosen to support stock. Does that make sense?
I get the argument, but it just makes Marxism-Leninism sound even like childisher than the intersectionals in my mind. Yeah.
Well, how about this? If you're a Marxist, you should hate wokeness, shouldn't you? I mean, of course, it's quite hard to find a definition for wokeness. But if you look at what the end of wokeness ultimately is, that is all diversity, is diversifying, for example, an entire corporation as is currently being kind of furthered. Well, no, does that actually equate to any systemic change?
Well, I wouldn't argue that's the end goal of wokeness. So Ash Sarkar argued this quite succinctly, surprisingly for her, which is that she defined woke culture, and Carl's featured it in his video, as on a political level, the redistribution of land, power, and wealth along race, gender, and class lines. So you can also expand that onto sexuality lines, sexual identity lines, and keep going, and it still sounds as stupid as it did begin with. Yeah. But that's the end goal that's not the same as just
she quite literally believes that when you actually have that new management class, if you like, comprised of people of those backgrounds that she's just described, you would then have a more equal society, and structural change would come about by those means. That's not what the Marxist-Leninists believe at all. They literally believe that those who are ultimately on the receiving end, economically speaking, of the class system are those that actually are in the epistemic position to transition, or shall we say, bring about the revolution.
But is that not the same thing happening with the Rainbow Coalition, as it's been dubbed? I mean, trans, homosexual, black nationalists, combine it all together. I mean, you've seen the
only that in the intersectionalist case, but it's a far more abstract claim to class. in the case of the wokists.
Sure, but I mean, I'm not a Marxist, so both of those sound stupid to me inherently. It's just this one's a more funny version, and I can't believe it's actually the majority position of modern left-wing politics.
But nonetheless, it's interesting. And I'm interested to see if, because of course there is no strong communist party in Britain, not least because it's not. We have, I suppose, a political tradition of slow, gradual change, which has been a very, very good antidote to revolutions. And there are too many communist parties in Britain, really, for communism itself to be a coherent force. Thankfully. But I am interested to see how the rest of the fringes or the communist fringes actually react to this, and what lines they take. But
I was Claire Fox these days stand on this kind of stuff, because I know she joined the Brexit Party.
To be honest, it's very, very hard to tell. I think in principle she still is she still looks at things in a fundamentally Marxist way, but quite clearly she's not a revolutionary anymore.
Yeah.
I can't see how she can be.
I mean, being in the House of Lords will do that to you. They want a revolution.
Well, that is exactly what the Marxists would say.
But also, I just find it interesting that she was at the Battle of Ideas event, for example. Kathleen Stock was meant to go to that, give a speech, and then Kathleen couldn't because of the threats made against her. She was just like, screw up, just going to stay home and eat bread.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that her attendance, Claire Fox's attendance at, what was it, the LGB event, would indicate that she's kind of on board with this.
Again, it just comes off as like the two retards fighting meme. You know that one? Where it's like two fat guys who are just fighting and it's like a YouTube thumbnail. Anyway, but that's what it comes off to me like, because you got the communists, or like the Claire Fox radical communist who's now doing God knows what. I don't know. It's weird. But you got like that, and they're like, yeah, so wokeness is bad. Why? Because it undermines class revolution. I was like, yeah, I don't care about that. Like, if that undermines that, okay. Couldn't give a toss. It's sort of like a Sunni or a Shia coming to me and being like, yeah, so undermines the Ummah ruling the world or something. I was like, is that a bad thing? But yeah. Anyway, that'll be my perspective on it, because I'm not sympathetic to any of that.
No, that's fair. I guess I'm just more curious to see where this goes.
Yeah, it's interesting to see where it's going.
Yeah,
it's like the joke meme of you remember in Birmingham there were those Muslims who were protesting that their children were being given reading materials that were promoting homosexuality, as they said, or paedophilia. Their arguments, and then there was like the idea of getting like Tommy Robinson of the world and the Muslims of the world all holding hands around the school to block it off. I mean, it's a weird coalition, but it could happen.
Yeah, but it's a coalition entirely.
Weird thing is saying with the anti-woke coalition, Claire Fox.
But it's a coalition that doesn't make sense in and of itself, given that, as I would say, the women part of it and the trans part of it, given that the trans bit's being collapsed into the LGBT's annexation of it, means that it can't be a coalition that ultimately lasts. Whereas, at least with the Marxist-Leninists, this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, at least in principle, has some consistency, even though it's there are, of course, flaws within the concept of the proletariat in that tradition, very deep flaws. But as a science, it makes sense, whereas that it doesn't make sense as a science in the intersectionists' case, I would say.
I don't agree either. That either are scientific in my view, but they're both
pseudosciences.
The interesting thing about the intersectional one is we did a premium podcast recently, so people should go check that out when it's out. In which Carl just went through Kimberly Crenshaw's essay on intersectionality, and one of the weird things, she makes an argument in there that essentially the black parts of the Rainbow Coalition politics, so the BLM types, let's say, are a direct contradiction with I think it was the women's liberation part, so the feminists, on the basis that black women, as she saw it, make up a matriarchy of their community, and therefore things should be kept that way. And if we give liberation to women to do this, that, and the other, then it's going to undermine black women. I'm not making this very clear. Go watch the premium podcast; it makes it much more clear. But she's noticing that there are contradictions even within the known framework, as you see with LGB Alliance versus the T part. Well, these are sexualities; these are gender identities, so they're not the same. Also, they have contradictory goals, so the coalition's never going to work.
Yeah, it would just result in infighting. Yeah, and there is infighting within critical race theory as well, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah. But I find it interesting that even at the primary document where she's writing, she's like, yeah, so none of this makes any sense, and we're going to be infighting all the time. Like, she's writing that in 89, and now it's like 2021, and it's starting to happen with LGBT Alliance versus LGBT.
Yeah. But no, just, I suppose, well, the position was leave it aside for now, and let's just march towards this end of history that we haven't, as of yet, defined for ourselves.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Just kill people until there's nothing left.
That does seem to be where it ends up.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full thing at 1 p.m. every weekday at lotuseaters.com, or you can sign up to get access to all the premium content we have on the site.
Yeah, we've got loads of really good stuff. Every week we have a Contemplations and Epochs episode that goes up, and in the Contemplations we talk about just interesting things, and the Epochs episodes are probably my favourite because I love talking about history. This latest one is we're doing a bit of a series on the 100 Years' War and why England kept winning. And we've not finished it yet, and you're going to really enjoy the end of that one. But we've also got other excellent episodes that we do, like the book club. The most recent one was Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell. This was about his time in Burma as a colonial officer, and when he was tasked with the shooting of a rampaging elephant. And it's really, really interesting what the circumstance of the thing was. But we also have lots of other content, such as premium articles, which have audio tracks on them for our silver and gold subscribers. And we do premium podcasts about things that we don't really feel that we can put on YouTube or have done a particularly large amount of research into. And so it's worth keeping them slightly more private. And we also do lots of very interesting interviews, such as this one with comedian Steve Hughes, which was really fascinating because I didn't expect him to be a philosopher. But anyway.
Yeah. Also, the last thing to mention is the live event content we have. So we occasionally, when we get around to it, doing our live events, and the videos from them are on the website as premium, of course, because people came to see and paid. So go and check that out. This is on the worst of critical race theory.
Yes.
And I do mean the worst.
It's unconscionable.
Yeah. So if you'd like access to all that premium content, go to lotuseaters.com and subscribe. Thank you and goodbye.